Welcome to IMPACTIFI. Rethink the possible.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're located. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for the conversation around leveraging EOR for business growth. It is hosted by both IMPACTIFI and Vensure Employer Solutions. A little bit about who we are. In case you don't know, IMPACTIFI is a firm that helps organizations that are looking to scale and are thinking about internationalization as part of that scaling process or strategy, I should say. And it's about community integration, market entry, but also providing access to finances, being grants, investments, multilateral funding, as well as validation and access to emerging tech. And with us, we have our three fantastic panelists who are representing different arms of Vensure and Employer Solutions. So if you want to quickly say hello and your role within Vensure, and then we'll go into the actual topics for today. Whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I guess I'll start. My name is Amy Despres. I'm the SVP of Global Client Operations and Partnerships here at Vensure.
Awesome. Dan, David?
Sure. My name is Dan Mastropola, and I oversee our direct venture staffing alliance program, which includes our direct staffing book, our domestic EOR called LightSource Global, back office company called Sunset Cove, and a third-party tech component called Campania.
And my name is Dave Burko, and I oversee strategic partnerships here at Vensure. Many of our strategic partners, of course, are very involved in expanding their clients globally, which is what brings me here today.
Fantastic. I'm very excited about our conversation. And a little background for those that are joining us. The reason we are having this conversation around this topic specifically is, we've been seeing consistently across the industries that the way companies grow has fundamentally changed, right? Prior to the pandemic, organizations were still hiring mostly or locally, expanding later, building teams primarily within geographic boundaries. And of course, that's changed over the last 6 years. And there's companies of all sizes that are building distributed teams, accessing talent globally, entering new markets. But at the same time, this also makes operational complexities increase, right? So when it comes to hiring and compliance and payroll, it could be a little overwhelming, especially if you are a small and medium-sized business and don't have all that infrastructure to support this. So that's what today's conversation is about. It's intended to be not a highly technical HR webinar, but it's really around the strategic and practical conversation of how you can leverage an employer of record. And of course, we'll go into what that means as a solution to grow smarter, faster, and more flexibly. So with that, let's get right into it. Let's start with talking a little bit about what exactly is EOR. So what is an employee of record? And I know we have our questions, but who wants to start with that?
Dan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can definitely take it. So basically, EOR stands for employer of record. And really what it basically boils down to is typically they're companies on a global side coming into the US that don't necessarily have an EIN, or businesses within the US that may be, basically trying to go into potentially, say, different vertical or something they're not super comfortable with. Typically contract an employer of record to basically handle all the aspects of the employment relationship. So, if you use the direct example of LightSource, on our side in the domestic US, we're taking all of the employment liabilities. We handle all the actual hiring, complexities and anything to do with the state, federal compliance of that employee. We're typically looked at as the employer of that employee at both the federal and the state level. And so, companies typically will come to us, that are not comfortable with those areas and really put us in charge of, all of the state regulations.
Thank you. And I know I took us off our originally flow, and I just felt like we needed to describe what that was as we get into it.
Sure.
So again, we're talking about how companies are thinking about workforce and growth change. So what are some things some of the changes that you all have seen? Because of course you're working more directly in this aspect of organization growth.
Sure.
I can start. Kind of like you started mentioning, Terry, COVID really changed the way that our businesses and the clients that we work with are looking at hiring and expansion. And, prior to COVID, there were companies that were hiring remotely and expanding globally, of course, but I think that event and being forced to rethink how you manage a team and where you find talent based on the fact that people had to, shelter in place and couldn't be in the brick and mortar office, it really tested what people thought about, collaboration and whether it was possible for them to get the same quality out of their business and the same growth without being, together in person and collaborating in the office. So after seeing how, it was out of necessity, after seeing how successful that was, a lot of the clients and customers that we've worked with have realized, there's a lot of cost and overhead associated with running an office. And if, you're getting the same quality, sometimes better, out of finding new ways to connect with your customers or your workforce remotely, they can often get a bigger savings by doing that. And by extension, it's really made a lot of our partners more bold in where they'll go and expand into. And I'm sure we're going to get into some of how they do that here shortly. But it's been really remarkable. And I'm sure that the others here will have more to add to that. But, where we see clients and partners we've been working with sometimes for 15 or 20 years who are really growing in ways they wouldn't have expected prior because they were locked into one either town or territory or region, and they're thinking beyond borders at this point.
Yeah, and I also think the biggest change is a change of mindset, right, with COVID. So when COVID hit, everybody's working from home. What do you care if they're working from home in New York, California, Florida, or in Costa Rica, or in Barcelona? It no longer mattered. So then you start saying, okay, let me just hire the best and the brightest.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about this is the companies that were expanding into the US were always thinking this way. It's just that everybody else has caught up. So when the folks were coming into the US historically, you might have one employee in the Bay, you might have one employee in New York, one in Florida, and they were just hiring where the best of that talent is. But now it seems like everybody else has taken that direct approach as well.
And that's a good point, because I don't think we have thought about that as much. That it's true when a company is internationalizing, it's almost natural for them to have employees in different locations because they have their core team maybe in their country of origin, and as they expand to the new area, then they start building teams there as well.
100% correct.
But because and I would say the U.S. traditionally has stayed within the U.S. when it comes to all that, it's new to us, so that's kind of neat. So why are we seeing growth stage and mid-market companies thinking internationally earlier than before?
Go ahead, Dave. You want me to start?
Yeah, I think that one of the main there's a couple things at play. They start thinking globally earlier because of the cost of talent, right?
Okay.
So one thing that they're thinking right out the gate is, if I hire someone overseas and I'm nearshoring, is it a different price, right? Can I cut some of my costs? Can I be more profitable? There's a ton of vendors out there that have made it so that these companies could scale and grow really quick with some amazing talent and resources that they couldn't have afforded in the US, or couldn't have grown as quickly in the US. One of them is Salvo Global, right? They right now have, I think, something like 50,000 people staffed to US companies right now. That's one area. The other area is just the buying power. Think about it. The United States has a population a little bit over 300 million. The middle class of India alone is $300 million. 300 million people. So, you don't just need to look at the US anymore. People are looking to go abroad much quicker.
Yeah. From the lens I sit on the staffing side, and just what we really do spend a lot of time talking about in the middle market today is also, right now, COVID expedited really what we call kind of this total talent management and like global workforce optimization. And when you're really in that mid market, right, and you're trying to basically stay competitive to people in the enterprise that have the buying power, right, these are strategies that you're looking at potentially basically bringing in to be able to actually be able to handle the footprint of what the demand basically comes back across our space. So, for us, a lot of times, when we're looking at things like, our internal recruiting teams, or if we're looking at where we can supplement a lot of our, back office financial resources, right? The natural resources, in our world, they are a little bit more of the dime a dozen. You can't really, always find those people very easily. And it doesn't change that the function's still needed. And I would say the second thing that really has been the driver for us is U.S. compliance has gotten really difficult. When you look at, changes in, New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois, there's more and more things that potentially come where if you are making mistakes or you're being asked to bring employees into those areas that you're not as comfortable with, the risk versus reward of actually doing that on your own dime while you're kind of learning is far out more than actually just outsourcing, to companies like ours, that actually know how to comply with the state regulations and things of that nature.
So that's actually a good segue for my next question, because I love the fact that because we're thinking hiring internationally, again, your small, medium-sized businesses are not getting access to more qualified talent because they don't have, like you just said, they're not competing with at the enterprise level. So that part is great, but I think with it comes complications like you were just mentioning, right? So what are some of these bigger operational and compliance challenges that organizations can be running into when they are hiring across regions or even across states, like you just mentioned?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Some of the biggest things that come up, like Dan mentioned, are sort of local or state or country specific compliance rules and regulations. But the top topics would be rules surrounding pay, PTO requirements, employment practices, including termination or severance. In the US, a big area would be benefits and strategy surrounding healthcare and benefits. And honestly, when we're talking EOR, there's a lot of different talk tracks we could take this in, but when we're talking EOR, an EOR partner is going to take a lot of that administrative burden and management of those issues off of the business owner, but as was already discussed. And, in the US, again, each state can be different, but then globally, each country can be different. And sometimes it feels like 50 different countries within the US. But the laws and the regulations, again, are all going to be different. For example, I mentioned benefits in the US, but a big one in Europe is, the handling of expenses and the legality around those being taxed properly and how much liability comes with that. So, an EOR allows you to partner with local experts and really make sure that as you're expanding, there's less fear because you are having that support when it comes to compliance.
Yeah. I mean, I love that because I think as a business owner myself, right, when I'm thinking about growing, I want to focus on how I'm growing, whether it's the client retention and client recruitment. I don't want to have to worry about all those administrative operational stuff that can boggle me down. So having a partner definitely sounds like a good idea. I don't know if, gentlemen, you wanted to add something to that, or if not, I have another.
I think one of the other big things, and again, focusing on the compliance component, and again, obviously, we all know it's hard to keep up, but it's also economically hard to keep up with the new rules and regulations. Think healthcare, right? We're seeing companies gain 30-40% increases on healthcare costs because of some of these very high expensive drugs now, right? But you're now required to offer medical insurance. You're also now required in certain states to offer 401k. That's a new cost. So all of these little things just added up, I would say are really hurting the US business owner.
That's true. So with that, I guess, what are some of the misconceptions that companies are seeing when they first start thinking about hiring either across states or across countries? What are some of these misconceptions? Is it the fact? I mean, I guess for me, it would be that people think everything is the same everywhere you go, which is
Yeah.
that happens to us all the time. People
Yeah.
think it's all the strategies the same, and it's not.
So I think the biggest misconception is, and I'll be nice about it. I think historically there was a lot of vendors that really took advantage of their customers, right? You expand over here and you're being charged $50,000 in fees and taxes that you can't even comprehend and understand. And a lot of those were just baked in fees by a vendor who was making a lot of money doing this. Now I think with more line item billing and more transparency, when you do meet that amazing candidate who's in Berlin, you're able to say, okay, this is my real cost. This is what it is. And yes, there's a little bit of a premium, but you don't have any of the risk. So I think that is a huge thing. A lot of folks now are starting to realize that they can come to the US too and test out the sales and marketing through an EOR without having to establish the entity. We will employ on their behalf. So this is a really big difference. Nothing is so permanent anymore. You have the flexibility to take the risk, I would say.
So that's a good one. I think let's dive that one a little bit, because I know that that's, again, working with companies who are looking to internationalize. One of the things they think they have to immediately incorporate and bring a team of people over automatically. We usually tell them, no, we got to test the market first and set up certain things in place before you start investing that kind of funding. So
absolutely,
that's a great point. That's another way to test the market, is by working with an EOR to bring maybe one or two of those individuals to help you test the market, right?
100%.
That's amazing. Sorry, Dan, I think, were you going to say something too, or did I?
I was just agreeing. I agree with that completely. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So are we seeing, and going back to the growth of these companies, are we seeing some delays because they don't know how to operationalize and how to, go through this process of growth, of team growth, I should say specifically? Are we seeing that, I guess, maybe let me rephrase the question. What are some of the hesitations you're seeing with companies as you're talking to them that maybe are thinking of, growing talent internationally, but are not sure what to do? They're not taking that first step. What are some of the hesitations?
I can definitely say from the clients that I'm working with, it's still a fairly newer topic that a lot of them are trying to navigate. And outside of mostly the enterprise market, right, we are just now starting to see some of the higher, what I'll call higher end middle market and the smaller size enterprise groups that are starting to adapt the strategy. I think there's a couple of things. Is really one, we've already touched on it. They're still a little hesitant of how mature are some of the companies that are actually operating in the space, and can they actually take some of the compliance risk, that if those people aren't really driving those things compliantly, where that kind of risk comes back to them, as basically owning really the client relationship specifically. The second thing is I think, it is very much them trying to kind of test the waters and kind of see where strategically they should be positioned, because, to be fair to the country landscape, as you go international, there are definitely pockets of talent in these countries that, typically have a focus of a skill set. And depending on what it is that you're trying to solve, trying to navigate who is the best partner and where are those skill sets more domiciled to, take some time to really vet. And then really, I think too, they're also really looking at the technology that's behind these, right? A lot of us that are on the higher mid-market and enterprise, we're already working out of, 20, 30 fragmented systems that don't make our lives really easy for processing. So when you're adding now another vendor and another payroll portal, you need to also be prepared for what that's going to be if you're not necessarily leading on the technology side to be able to integrate, those things to daily workflows. And just that also comes with, I think going back to your last question, what I was going to add on the misconception is, yes, you put a lot of things on the third party to manage it, but it still takes somebody typically to manage the partnership, right? And so, this isn't normally just a set it, forget it, I'm just hiring you. There is a strategic partnership between the vendors and clients that really do need to mature to really make sure that you have that kind of level of partnership to expand these programs, I think also comes into it.
Yes. Well, I like that. Yes, you definitely have to keep communication with your partners. Um,
Just using a real world example or two, I've also seen companies that have been hesitant to grow because they're worried about being too successful and can they manage it? And
Good point.
are we going to be able, as we said earlier, to manage such a large remote workforce? And there's always that balancing act between the cost to the benefit of where they're looking to expand, and with the fear that comes with a growing workforce, right? Like, what if there's a legal issue that comes up and that, could be very costly to the company? Or, how do we ensure that there's consistency, whether it's a product or a service, or just in the vision of what they have sort of at the local level or where we're operating today? How do they ensure that what branding and messaging for their company that they want to put out there is also going to be able to be expanded as they grow? So they're all fears. Sometimes being too successful is just as much of a fear of determining when they're ready to do that as well.
Yeah.
I also
Okay.
think there's the biggest fear, of course, fear of the wrong of making the wrong hire, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I think one of the most incredible examples that you could see is you have such amazing tech talent, right, in the Ukraine. I think that's a source of, I forgot the statistic off the top of my head, but you're looking at a major, major, major portion of tech outsourcing going to Ukraine right now. And despite the war, it's still there. And the companies that have successfully hired the most are the ones that are incorporating that team into the rest of the organization. So we have a client right now, and it's a really amazing story. They had numerous employees in Ukraine. Obviously, they're affected by everything terrible that's going on there. They all met in Italy recently for a workshop. And this is something that they were, one, able to build a culture together, and it helped solidify the quality of that talent that they had, and they double and tripled and quadrupled down on it. So I think that making them part of the team and not just alone on their own island is one of the big differentiators.
And that's a good point. I think as you start thinking about international hires, making sure that the culture of the organization takes that into consideration, right? So how do you make everybody feel part of the team and that they're contributing, so they're not just like a contractor off on the side by their own that nobody's talking to?
You've got it.
That's important. That's important to take into consideration. All right, so we described or defined what an EOR is, and we've been talking a little bit about that, but I'm sure that there are people that may still be confused of the difference between an EOR, a staffing firm, a PEO, or just opening your own, doing it through your own. So what are, I guess, some of the pros and the cons, or some of the overlaps to help provide clarification?
Dan, I think this one might be a good one for you to start with.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the major benefits are obviously being able to have a partner that really can help educate you and get you through the compliantal aspects. I think the second thing is, just like other things, you're leveraging the buying power of, basically their ecosystem, right? So like we talked about, benefits and some of those other things, right? But like, a lot of companies in a startup category can't get really into Fortune 500 benefits due to participations and other things of that nature. So, having the EOR as an avenue to really be able to attract talent, especially early on in the business journey, is another really big one. That's personally, how I started most of my startups when I was on, the client side of this equation. I think we talked a lot about the other one, which is leveraging, the actual access to talent in typically, outside markets or globally that are maybe not as readily available. The other ones I'd add in are, we are starting to see quite a bit of rise in like statement of work and more project-based work, which, sometimes is another one that's driving a lot of the volumes coming in. And And then also, I would say just technology. A lot of our technology in the US is not built to basically handle a totality of workforce. So, having basically, baseline systems that are there to help manage to the country compliance and, be able to leverage things like onboarding, time and labor management, other things for, benefit management, having that kind of totality in a lot of our other situations, right? That's what's causing us as, the fragmented technology landscapes of these things, and even our US domiciled businesses, right? Normally these are all independent vendors. It gets super complicated to keep up with when things need to be filed and when, you have renewals and all the things that go into that. So, I think those are really the biggest benefits people have when they're really, just either A, uneducated, or B, just don't want to manage it in-house because it's distracting from, the revenue growth of the business.
Well, I would add, you mentioned the difference between, say, an EOR and a PEO. And, from an operational perspective, PEOs are something we leverage here in the US. They're also known as co-employment. And there's more of a collaborative experience for the customer or the client when they're in a PEO, right? So the PEO
maybe we should define PEO. I just realized that I used it.
Yeah. So PEO stands for Professional Employment Organization. That is one of the functions we have here at Vensure. And it is a very popular model in the US for the reasons I will explain. But the PEO, again, co-employment relationship allows for a business to partner with the PEO, and the PEO takes on a lot of the administrative functions, filing taxes, processing payroll, managing a lot of that, again, that administrative side of employment, where the business owner or leadership team still maintains a lot of the day-to-day management of the workforce. They're still involved in day-to-day decision making. Even with the HR support of a PEO, it's more a consultant and support and strategy partner. So the business owner and their team still maintain a lot of that interaction with the employees and day-to-day management of the workforce on site. Whereas we have some PEO clients who've chosen to switch to an EOR model, which is more like what we've been talking about, which allows even more of that administrative day-to-day management of employees to transfer over to the EOR. So, and using US as an example, we would handle the onboarding of the employees. We would handle any direct questions they have as the employer of record. Maybe they have a question about, elements of their healthcare plan. They direct those to us, not the business owner. So it's a full outsourcing of the management of the employees with the EOR model. But one big advantage that we sometimes don't bring up when we're talking about growth is the other side, which is maybe they're ready to downsize a particular territory or area. And, in a co-employment relationship or PEO, obviously we are going to give advice, but the actual decision-making of, releasing the employees or, deciding when it's appropriate to downsize, that all still remains at the business owner level or the management level. But in an EOR relationship, those decisions can be made and articulated to us. And then the EOR is the one that would handle all of those conversations and preparing severance information, managing COBRA questions for any benefits after the fact. So again, if you're testing new markets and territories, it could be very appealing, depending on your business needs, to go with that EOR model to completely outsource. But if you're somebody who is very involved and wants to maintain sort of managing your team directly, in the US, co-employment is a little bit more favorable, because you still get that support, but you're doing more of that hands-on management.
Oh, wow. Okay, you got me thinking. I like that. So it's almost like a scaled approach to some degree, right? If I were to simplify it for very, very lay terms, right? So we have with the PEO, we're both managing, right? So you're doing the administrative and piece of it, but we're managing and making decisions together on how we handle the employee. With the EOR, we're letting you know, here's what we think we need to do, but the EOR then makes a decision of how that happens or how that is implemented, if I were to oversimplify this. Yeah, is that okay?
I think that's a great way of simplifying that.
Yeah,
I like to
nailed it. You'd
oversimplify
be
things
going
all
to
the time. I'm
PEO
like, all right.
sales.
yeah.
Okay, but that's awesome because again, I don't think people realize that there's these kinds of resources out there, which is why we're having this conversation. And even myself, as we started our partnership with you all, is like learning things every time I talk to you, I feel like I'm learning something new. So I love it. Okay, so are there any specific stages or phase that a company should be in when they start thinking about this? Is because a lot of time that I think just in general, companies are never sure when it's time to grow. It's like especially startups or early stage companies, it's like, okay, I know we're overwhelmed and we need to bring in, but cash flow doesn't meet the need for employee. But is there any recommendations as to when we should start thinking about that EOR or PEO or just hiring in general?
It's a great question. I think,
and I know it's a loaded question and
yeah,
it has
no,
a
it
lot
is.
of variables, but
Yeah, from the perspective that we look, or that I basically sit in this equation, like I think it's always really good if you are typically a startup business and you really don't necessarily know what it goes into the human capital side of the business, right? I joke around, but a lot of people typically start because of the fact that they either came from sales or some type of operational found a problem, went to go try to solve a problem, right? That's normally how most businesses start, right? So, but it is, those early stages are, you're just navigating so many other things. But the way I always say it is, when you're making a decision, do you want to work on the business or in the business? Because those are two different kind of equations, right? If you want to work on the business, typically it's a great starting point because these things can just be plug and play and go and can definitely expedite, being able to move at a different rate, than basically having to go through the painstakingness of, building all this in-house and then having to manage. And typically, when you think about really the key roles that these things solve, right, it's your HR department, it's your compliance risk, it's your payroll department. Like a lot of those things are not necessarily revenue generating, they're, revenue protecting, right? And so, a lot of times if you fall into one of those equations, for me, it's where you're really, kind of more on the EOR side. When you go back to the PEO side, it's more like you're a demonstrated business owner, or you at least understand the fundamentals of these things and just want to be able to leverage more of kind of those buying powers of what we kind of talked about, because you're competent, you're competent enough in understanding, yes, I need to build a new hire handbook and I need HR to just help me understand how to evolve that over time, or I already am comfortable with the function of payroll, but I just don't necessarily want to bring that in-house, but I at least have the mechanics of those things, right? It's always a graduational step for me in how I normally explain that. And when you really understand the business, then PEO can just be leveraged really more in those early stages to grow through, those like kind of first cycle, kind of iterations of the business. And then once you finally start to have, repetitive, repeatable processes to these things, then it's normally easier to hand off or bring in house, and kind of graduate through the rest of the maturity cycle.
That was well
Yeah.
said.
I think
the picture.
EOR sometimes, what we see is it's used just like another tool in the toolbox, depending on where the business is at. Kind of like Dan's saying, it really depends on where they are in their journey. But we've seen, again, we talked about just getting started. You might want to test a particular market. EOR is a great way to do that without starting your own entity, especially in a new country that you might not be familiar with. And then midsize, again, it's that balance of, that cost to benefit ratio. Sometimes it's better to sort of, hire an EOR, pay maybe that premium or a little bit more to have all of that fully resourced, so that there's one thing that nobody can make more of, and that's time. And so when Dan said about working on or in the business, that's what comes to my mind, is you only have so many hours in a day and certain things that only the business owner or the key personnel can do. So there are times where using EOR as a tool to get you to that next phase is a way, again, of outsourcing some of that work that doesn't have to be done by those key people. And then when a company gets to like a larger size and starts really expanding into new markets, we've seen, even if they're partnered PEO with us in the US, they want to test out a couple of new markets elsewhere. They'll start, using EOR as a way to do that. And then if they have a particular country that they get a really large workforce in, at that point, they look to, okay, is it time are we at a place where it makes sense to go ahead and actually start an entity and put a permanent workforce there that's off of the EOR? So it's kind of like, again, just a tool in the toolbox, and depending on where they are at in their growth and business journey. But that's why working with partners, obviously like ours, but partners that have that ability to sort of do these different models is helpful, because, they can consult and sort of look at, what are their business plans this year, 5 years, 10 years even, and kind of picking and advising on when that might be a good time to start using those tools in different combinations and ways for growth.
That makes sense. I like that. So, as you can tell, I'm visual and I like to oversimplify things, but I like to see use cases also. Are there any maybe an example? I know, David, you mentioned one earlier of a use case specifically, but is there any other example that we could talk about where somebody was leveraging EOR as a strategic advantage, or maybe, with the PEO, anything you can think of?
Yeah, absolutely. We see companies, hundreds of companies coming over to test the US market with one employee. And some of them decide, it's just not the right time. And the nice thing about having an EOR, going with an EOR model, is you could just stop. It's not a long-term commitment. It is not, it's not a marriage that you can't get out of it. It's really, a test, right? Let's test this, see if we can work. What's amazing though, is when you do get those companies that come over with 1 or 2 or 3 people, they scale on the EOR to 20, 30, and then they say, wait, I need to establish an entity here. I need to start building in the United States. And that's a really nice big win. We have a client, which I would argue is a success story, came over with 1 person, grew to 30, said, I now have my entity here. I want to employ, I want to make this a hub. And they then switched to a PEO. They now were sponsoring visas. They were bringing over top talent. They were hiring talent in the US, creating jobs, which is the most important thing from a US standpoint for people that are entering the United States. Are you here to create jobs? And these guys are creating jobs. And then they actually fired us. And, that is a win for us. If a company is with us, grows to 500 people, fires us as a PEO, and is just using us as a payroll vendor, this is an amazing thing, from 1 to 500. And this happens all the time when they partner with us, where they're really able to grow and scale and, create an amazing business here in the United States that's employing a ton of Americans. So in instances like that, when you fire me from one product and go to a more self-sufficient product, this is a win that we applaud all day long.
I would agree, because I would agree, because it talks about the efficiency of your partnership, right? You're saying, hey, I'm providing, because you're providing all the tools, and then they're learning and they're building, and then once it's built, then the fact that they're able to graduate out, I think speaks for you guys as an organization. So that's fantastic. I agree.
It's funny. Our big joke is we should have testimonials of, hey, it's easy to fire us on this product and go on to the next one.
Yeah, I can also just say too, I lived that with Vensure before I worked for Vensure, right? So I was a prime example of exactly that. We did have a really strong team, so we started more in PEO first, but that was an early phase of the business. We needed to attract, we were heavily funded. We just wanted to attract A players, and we knew we were never going to be able to do it. So we grew, I want to say, to about almost 500, 600 employees. And then we basically went to an ASO model. And then we basically went to payroll only. And, we still leverage basically HR services, right? So, just understanding that you have partners like Vensure that is really not what we call kind of box PEO. We're really able to help companies navigate all of the complexities of what they may be going through. And now adding the global side for us is really allowing us to really, give people a ton of creative options, through whatever it is that they're navigating. But I agree with David. It is a really big success party when you guys really learn that partnership and you're hitting stride, it's really cool to watch that grow and be, kind of supporting at different layers of the maturity cycle.
All right, so we have
Give you one more example, Terry.
Oh, yes, love examples.
Because since you love a good use case, we have one client that partners with us that started as a PEO and then decided that they just don't like doing the actual hands-on employment piece. They don't like doing the onboarding. They did not want to have a whole staff because they grew so big, really. And like Dan and Dave said, a lot of times when a company grows big enough, they'll go more like a payroll only, or Dan used the term ASO, which is administrative services only, which is kind of like payroll plus like tax filing and things like that. A lot of times they'll go that way and then hire an internal staff. This business owner is like, yeah, absolutely not, because I don't even want to have to manage my administrative team. So he flipped back over with a very large workforce to EOR so that all of the day-to-day and people management could be outsourced to us as the EOR. So it really is like we were just talking about, what works best for that business at the stage that they're at, and kind of pairing those options, with their goals.
Yeah, that's a good example because it's not a linear thing. You can go back and forth and, depending on what your needs are, where you are. That's neat. All right, so we have about 4 minutes or so left of our talk. Is there anything that we didn't go over that you feel we need to share with our audience? Anything that you want them to walk away with specifically? Or what is the one takeaway if they listen to the whole thing?
I would just say, again, not to be afraid of considering other alternatives or other alternative types of hiring. And don't be afraid of those expansion opportunities, whether you're already partnered with a PEO or an EOR, or you're thinking about growing into a new territory. It doesn't hurt to have the conversation and to really get, again, those experts in the room just for a conversation and talk about where you're at. There are just so many different ways, like we've been talking about, to scale and build your things out that, it doesn't cost anything for a conversation. And it's often you're going to walk away with at least a piece of knowledge you didn't have, if not a plan for how to move forward.
I would say my final thoughts really are, if you could envision it, there's a lot of really legitimate, amazing vendors out there that could help you build it and scale it in a compliant way. And as you're building and scaling, it's also to think, hey, while I'm going global, I personally need to go global too, and get on the plane and meet with my team in the new location and have them meet us and continue to build on the current company culture that got you to where you are today, which is expanding globally.
Love that.
Yeah, for me, I know a lot of business owners, not just think about the compliance aspects and just like the business use cases for this, but they may not understand that these strategies can be used to also attract new revenue to the business. And so, really pushing yourself to not be afraid to, like, if you're in these conversations and companies are asking you to troubleshoot how these things can be solved, like that's another area that, companies like ours can really help. You just come to us with, what the clients are looking for. We probably have a solution that can help add these things and also educate how you can basically utilize them to drive the revenue of the business and expand, a lot faster into areas that maybe you're not thinking about.
Love it. Love it. Love it. I think overall message is, if you're growing or scaling, you're not alone. There are a lot of resources out there. Of course, Vensure, shameless plug, IMPACTIFI, that's what we do. Or, try to help you as well. But I loved our conversation. I think this is a great first part of our series, because I know we're going to have more webinars where we'll dive a little deeper into various topics around this. But this, for those that don't know, this conversation also started because of a program that we held a couple of weeks ago, the Market Expansion and Trade Forum, where there were a lot of questions. People that were there in attendance, we just introduced Vensure, and people were in awe that this was even a resource that existed. So we said, oh, we got to tell others. And that's why we're doing this. So thank you all for the time to have this conversation with me. And I enjoyed it a lot, and I look forward to the next one. And for everybody that joined us, thank you for taking the time. Please send us your feedback if you have any questions or anything specific that you want us to address in our next series, or next session of the series. We look forward to it. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Thank you.